The first thing I noticed was the silence. Normally, when I stepped out onto the back porch in the morning, the wind moved through the tall pine trees behind the house. The branches swayed, birds hopped between them, and the shade covered most of the yard. That morning, none of that was there. Instead, sunlight hit the porch directly.
Bright.
Harsh.
Wrong.
I looked up, and my stomach dropped. 3 of the largest pine trees on the back edge of my property were gone. Not trimmed. Not damaged.
Gone.
All that remained were fresh stumps, pale wood exposed where the trunks had been cut. Sawdust covered the ground like someone had just finished the job hours earlier. Those trees had been there longer than my house. At least 40 years. They formed a natural border between my property and the large house on the hill behind it. Karen's house. I walked closer to the stumps, trying to understand what I was seeing. Clean chainsaw cuts. Professional work. Which meant someone had come onto my property with equipment and taken them down deliberately. That's when I noticed the tire tracks. They led straight from the gravel road that ran behind my land. The same private road the HOA used for maintenance vehicles and landscaping crews. And suddenly, I had a very good idea who was responsible. Karen had been complaining about those trees for months. According to her, they blocked the beautiful valley view from the back deck of her house. Never mind the fact that the trees were entirely on my property. Never mind that they had been there decades before she moved into the neighborhood. To Karen, the solution was simple. Remove the trees. Preferably by convincing the HOA that they were some kind of violation. The first complaint had come 6 weeks earlier. An email from the HOA landscaping committee saying the trees were interfering with shared scenic visibility. I'd responded politely. The trees were on my land. They weren't diseased. They weren't dangerous. And they definitely weren't coming down. Karen didn't like that answer. A week later, she knocked on my door personally, clipboard in hand. Same tight smile she always wore when she thought she was enforcing the rules. You really should reconsider removing those trees, she said. They block the view for multiple properties. They block the view from your deck, I replied. That's the same thing. No, it isn't. Her smile tightened. The HOA might decide otherwise. They're welcome to try. She stared at me for a moment, clearly expecting me to back down. When I didn't, she turned and walked away. I thought that was the end of it. After all, even the HOA didn't have authority to remove trees from private property without permission. At least, that's what I thought. But standing there in my backyard, looking at the fresh stumps and scattered sawdust, it was obvious someone had decided the rules didn't apply. And there was only one person in the neighborhood stubborn enough to push something like that through.
Karen.
I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything. The stumps, the tire tracks, the equipment marks in the dirt. Then I walked to the back fence and looked toward the gravel road. That road ran behind my property and connected the entire subdivision to the main highway. The funny thing about it, the land the road sat on also belonged to me. Most people in the neighborhood didn't realize that. Years ago, when the developer built the subdivision, they negotiated an access agreement to run the road across the edge of my property. The HOA maintained it, but legally, it was still my land. And the agreement included one very important clause. If the HOA or its members caused property damage without permission, access rights could be suspended. Standing there next to those fresh stumps, I looked back toward the road, then toward Karen's house on the hill. Because if she really thought cutting down my trees was the solution to her view problem, she was about to discover what happened when someone messed with the one person who technically owned the only road out of the neighborhood. I didn't confront Karen right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because experience has taught me something about situations like this. You never act first. You document first. So I spent the next hour walking the property line behind my house with my phone. Pictures of the stumps from every angle. Close-ups of the chainsaw cuts. Wide shots showing exactly where the trees had stood. Then I followed the tire tracks. They ran straight from the gravel road, through a small opening in the brush, and directly to where the trees had been. Heavy equipment had definitely been there. Probably a landscaping truck or tree service vehicle, which meant whoever ordered the job had hired professionals. No one accidentally cuts down 3 40-foot pine trees. This was planned. And the more I thought about it, the more obvious the explanation became. Karen had finally gotten tired of arguing with me. So instead, she'd convinced someone that the trees needed to go. Or worse, she'd told them the HOA had authority to remove them. Either way, someone had stepped onto my land and destroyed property worth several $1,000s. And that meant the next step wasn't knocking on doors. It was calling the sheriff's office. The deputy who arrived about 40 minutes later took one look at the stumps and whistled quietly. Those were big trees. About 40 years old, I said. Any idea who cut them down? I've got a pretty good guess. He nodded and started writing notes while I explained the situation. The property line. The HOA road access agreement. Karen's complaints about the view. When I finished, he walked over to the tire tracks leading back to the gravel road. Looks like a truck came in from there, he said. Exactly. Anyone have permission to access your land? Not unless I give it. He scribbled something else in the notebook. Well, if someone hired a crew to remove trees on property they don't own, that's criminal damage. I appreciated the way he said it so calmly. Like this wasn't some petty neighbor dispute. Because it wasn't. 3 mature pine trees can be worth thousands of dollars depending on the species and age. And removing them without permission? That can carry serious penalties. The deputies straightened up. I'll need to talk to the HOA and see who ordered the work. I can save you some time, I said. He raised an eyebrow. Karen Mitchell. You sure about that? Very. He nodded slowly. Well, we'll confirm it. The investigation didn't take long. By the end of the afternoon, the deputy called me back. You were right, he said. Apparently, Karen had contacted a local landscaping company and told them the HOA had approved removal of problem trees along the back property line. She even showed them the gravel road access and told them where to park the truck. The crew never questioned it. They assumed she had authority, which meant they weren't really the problem. Karen was. Did the company realize the trees were on your land? The deputy asked.
No.
Figures. Now the situation was officially on record. Property damage. Unauthorized entry. False representation. Not a great combination. But the deputy asked me one more question before ending the call. You planning to pursue charges? I thought about that for a moment. Then I looked out my back window toward the gravel road behind the house. Because technically, the road wasn't HOA property. It just crossed my land under a written access agreement. And that agreement had a clause most people in the neighborhood had never read. If the HOA or its representatives caused intentional property damage, the access could be temporarily revoked, meaning the entire neighborhood could lose its main road. I smiled slightly. I'm still deciding, I told the deputy. But I think Karen and the HOA are about to learn something about that road they've been using for the last 20 years. Because cutting down my trees might have improved her view. But it also gave me a legal reason to do something that was going to make the entire neighborhood notice very quickly. All I had to do was lock one gate. The next morning, I drove down to the county records office. Not because I doubted what I already knew, but because when you're dealing with an HOA, paperwork matters more than opinions. And I wanted everything confirmed in black and white. The clerk pulled up the original development documents from when the subdivision had been built 20 years earlier. Sure enough, the paperwork showed exactly what I remembered. The gravel road that ran behind my property wasn't owned by the HOA. It crossed a 20-foot access easement on land that legally belonged to me. The agreement allowed neighborhood residents to use the road to reach the main highway. But the easement came with several conditions. One of them was written in very clear legal language. If the property owner suffered damage caused by the HOA or its representatives, access rights could be temporarily suspended until the dispute was resolved. In other words, if the HOA destroyed something on my land, I had the legal right to shut the road down. Temporarily, of course, but long enough to get their attention. And after 3 40-foot pine trees had been cut down without my permission, I'd say that qualified. I printed copies of the documents and drove back home. Then I did something very simple. I installed a gate. Nothing fancy. Just a heavy metal ranch gate across the entrance where the gravel road connected to the main highway. The posts were already there from an old fence line.
All I had to do was hang the gate and attach a chain.
Then I added a laminated sign. Road closed, property damage dispute. Below that, I included a short note referencing the easement clause and the date the trees had been cut down.
Clear. Direct.
Legal. By the time I finished, it was early afternoon. And right on schedule, the first car from the neighborhood pulled up to the gate about 10 minutes later. A silver SUV stopped. The driver stared at the sign, then at the lock chain, then backed up slowly and turned around. Within half an hour, 3 more cars arrived. Same reaction, every time. Stop.
Read the sign.
Look confused. Turn around. Because the truth was, the gravel road was the shortest route out of the subdivision. Without it, residents had to drive an extra 15 minutes around the long access road on the other side of the development. Not the end of the world, but definitely inconvenient. And inconveniences travel through HOA neighborhoods faster than gossip. Sure enough, my phone rang about 45 minutes later. The caller ID said Pine Ridge HOA office. I answered. Hello. The voice on the other end sounded tense. Hi, this is Linda from the HOA management office. We've received several reports that the back access road is blocked. That's correct. There's a gate across it. Yes. Well, that road provides neighborhood access. It crosses my property. A pause. Yes, but the HOA maintains it. Maintenance doesn't equal ownership. Another pause. Then the question I had been waiting for. Why is the road closed? I glanced out the window toward the empty space where my trees used to stand. Property damage, I said calmly. What property damage? 3 40-year-old pine trees that were cut down yesterday. Silence. Then Linda said something that told me exactly how little the HOA office knew about Karen's little project. Oh, I'm not aware of that. I'm sure Karen is. The silence that followed lasted several seconds longer. Because now the management office understood something important. If the road closure was tied to an easement dispute, this wasn't just a neighbor argument anymore. This was a legal problem for the HOA. And legal problems tend to move quickly when they affect an entire neighborhood. Sure enough, about an hour later, Karen showed up at my gate. And she looked furious. Karen didn't bother knocking on my door. She marched straight up the driveway, like she owned the place. I saw her coming through the front window and stepped outside before she even reached the porch. What do you think you're doing? She demanded. I leaned against the railing. Enjoying my afternoon. You blocked the road. Yes. That road belongs to the HOA. No, I said calmly. It crosses my land. Karen pointed down the hill toward the locked gate. Residents are already complaining. I'm sure they are. You can't just shut down neighborhood access because you're upset about landscaping. I almost laughed. Landscaping. You know exactly what I mean. I looked past her toward the back of the property where the trees had stood the day before. You cut down 3 of my trees. They were blocking the view. They were on my property. Karen folded her arms. The HOA has authority over shared scenic lines. That's not a thing. Yes, it is. No, I said. It really isn't. For a moment, she just stared at me. Then, she changed tactics. Look, the landscaping company said those trees were part of the property boundary. They weren't. Well, the damage is already done. That was the moment I realized Karen still didn't understand how serious the situation was. She thought this was a minor argument. An HOA dispute. Something that could be smoothed over with a few words and maybe a complaint letter. So I pulled the folded documents from my pocket and handed them to her. She glanced down at the papers. What's this? The road easement agreement. She skimmed the page. Then her eyes stopped on the highlighted section. The clause about property damage. If the property owner suffers damage caused by the HOA or its representatives. Her voice slowed as she read. Access rights may be suspended until the dispute is resolved. She looked up. You're actually enforcing this? Yes. You're punishing the whole neighborhood. No, I said calmly. I'm responding to the person who cut down my trees. Karen's face flushed red. You can't prove I did that. I shrugged. The landscaping company already confirmed who hired them. That got her attention. For the first time since she arrived, Karen looked uncertain. You talked to them? The sheriff's office did. Now her expression changed completely. What? Turns out hiring someone to remove trees on property you don't own is a problem. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. The confidence was gone. Because suddenly this wasn't just about a view anymore. It was about property damage. And possibly criminal charges. But the real pressure wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the neighborhood. As we stood there talking, another car pulled up to the locked gate at the bottom of the road. The driver stepped out, read the sign, and looked up toward us. Then he turned around and drove back toward the subdivision. Karen followed the car with her eyes. People are going to be furious about this. They should be. You're causing a lot of trouble. No, I said quietly. I'm responding to it. Karen looked down at the easement document again. For the first time since this whole situation started, she didn't have anything to say. But the rest of the neighborhood definitely did. Because by that evening, the HOA board had scheduled an emergency meeting. And Karen's decision to cut down my trees was about to become the biggest problem they had ever dealt with. The emergency HOA meeting happened the very next evening. Normally, those meetings barely attracted 10 people. This time, the clubhouse was packed. Apparently, adding 15 minutes to everyone's commute had a way of getting the neighborhood's attention. By the time I walked in, residents were already arguing in small groups. Why is the road closed? Who cut down the trees? Why didn't the board know about this? Karen sat at the front table with the rest of the HOA board. For once, she didn't look confident. The HOA president called the meeting to order. His voice sounded tired. Thank you all for coming. We're here to address the road closure and the property damage dispute involving Mr. Walker's land. Every head in the room turned toward me. The president continued. As many of you know, the back access road crosses private property under an easement agreement. A few residents murmured. Most of them clearly hadn't known that. The property owner has temporarily suspended access after several trees were removed from his land without permission. Then he looked directly at Karen. Karen, did you hire a landscaping company to remove those trees? Karen shifted in her seat. They were blocking the community view. That's not what I asked. They were interfering with scenic visibility. The president sighed. Did you hire the company? After a moment, Karen muttered. Yes. The room exploded. People started talking all at once. You cut down someone else's trees? That's illegal. My commute was 40 minutes longer this morning. The HOA president slammed his gavel on the table. Quiet. The room slowly settled down again. Then he looked back at Karen. Did you have permission from the property owner?
No.
Did the HOA board approve the removal? Karen hesitated. No. The silence that followed was heavy. One of the other board members leaned forward. Karen, do you understand that you just exposed the HOA to a property damage claim? Karen looked defensive again. It was for the neighborhood's benefit. The board member shook his head. You destroyed private property. Another resident stood up from the back row. So, that's why we can't use the road? The president nodded.
Yes.
The easement agreement allows the property owner to suspend access if damage occurs. People groaned. Someone else muttered. Unbelievable. The president turned back toward me. Mr. Walker, what would it take to resolve this dispute and reopen the road? The room went quiet again. I stood up slowly. It's pretty simple, I said. The trees that were cut down were over 40 years old. I pulled out a printed estimate from a local arborist. Replacing them with mature trees will cost about $18,000.
A few people gasped.
Karen's eyes widened. You're serious? Very. I set the estimate on the table. The road stays closed until the damage is paid for. The HOA board members exchanged uneasy looks, because now they understood the real problem. If Karen didn't pay, the HOA might have to. And if that happened, every homeowner in the room would feel it through their HOA fees. The president rubbed his temples. Karen, we need to discuss this privately. The meeting ended shortly after that. 2 days later, the HOA sent me an official notice. Karen had agreed to pay for the replacement trees. The landscaping company would install them within the month. And once the agreement was signed, I reopened the gate. The road went back to normal. The neighborhood returned to its quiet routine. And Karen? She never complained about the view again. Because sometimes the fastest way to teach someone about property rights is to remind them exactly who owns the road they're driving on.